I'm going to talk a little bit about the current voting rights legal landscape, what we've been doing at the ACLU, and sort of the way forward on some of the challenges that we're facing right now. But I want to leave a little bit of time for some Q&A. So I'm probably only going to talk for about 35 minutes or so, and then hopefully we can have a conversation after that. So as Corona said, I am the director of the Voting Rights Project at the American Civil Liberties Union. It sounds like you're all familiar with the ACLU and what it is that we do, so I won't bore you with any of those details. I'm just going to get right into what I see when I look at the legal landscape surrounding voting rights right now, and some of the trends, and what I think is sort of the path forward. So the sobering news that I want to deliver to you all is that voting rights in this country are under attack in a way that we have not seen in at least a generation. So if you look at, and I'm talking about a relatively recent development, if you look at, say, 2011, 2012, during those 2 years, in the run-up to the 2012 presidential election, 19 states passed 25 laws that either made it harder to register to vote, shortened curtailed opportunities to vote, whether cutting early voting or times on which you could vote, or imposed new barriers to people trying to vote on election day. And for people like me who work in voting rights, that was a massive, massive sea change from what we had been seeing prior to that point. I mean, if you just kind of take a step back and you think about the period from 1964 or so to the present, right, or to that period, to 2010. The trajectory on voting rights and the laws around voting rights was, generally speaking, a progressive one. Things were getting, easier to vote. I look back at 1964, so I kind of blew by how honored I am to be here. I mean, I remember when I was in high school and I learned the story of Andy Goodman, and how I was just so moved by what people did in '64 in Mississippi in Freedom Summer. It was one of the things that made me want to be a civil rights lawyer. Right? You look at 1964, Mississippi. Maybe I'm telling you stuff that you already know, and I apologize if I'm doing that. But the voter registration rate for African Americans in Mississippi in 1964 was less than 7%. Right? They had the lowest registration rate Mississippi did of any state in the country for African Americans. Right? 1965, the Selma to Montgomery March out of Alabama. Right? I think the registration rate for African Americans in Alabama was under 20% in 1965. But from that movement, we got the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which eliminated literacy tests, which were one of the biggest barriers to participation in the country at that time. A year later, in 1966, the Supreme Court struck down poll taxes, right? And those events just catalyzed tremendous, tremendous change in this country. And not only in terms of the law, but in terms of the culture. Because we had at that point what was something of a consensus that we ought to be bringing more people into the democratic process, that we ought to be eliminating barriers to people's participation, that we ought to be making voting easier instead of harder. And if you look at that period, right, registration rates skyrocketed in the South. 17 years after the Voting Rights Act passed, 1982, Ronald Reagan, who's very conservative, right, who launched his presidential campaign in 1980, I think shamefully, in Philadelphia, Mississippi, just miles away from where Andy Goodman was murdered, right? Even Ronald Reagan in 1982, he signed a reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, and he described it as the crown jewel of American civil liberties, of American civil rights protections. 11 years after that, Bill Clinton signed the National Voter Registration Act, something called sometimes called the Motor Voter Law, right, which made voting relatively standardized around the country, registration practices anyway. 2002, after the debacle of the 2000 election in Florida, George W. Bush signed the Help America Vote Act, which brought our voting technology up into line with what were then current standards. We still have some problems today, which I'll probably spend a little bit of time talking about. 4 years after that, George W. Bush signed another reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, which passed 98-0 in the Senate, right? No one voted against this. We had a consensus in this country that we ought to be making voting easier. Now, that's not to say that we didn't have controversies about voting rights. Of course we did. We had lots of disagreements about what voting should look like, what registration should look like. We had lots of long-standing barriers, felon disenfranchisement, right? The practice of stripping the right to vote from people because of a criminal conviction. We'll talk a little bit more about that later today. We had obviously lots of practices that are anti-democratic, that entrench, in some ways, minority rule in this country. And I'm talking about things like, you know, the Senate, the Electoral College, and the maldistribution of political power that results from those institutions. So I don't mean to say that from 1965 to 2010, everything was great on voting rights, right? There were still a lot of people working to reform our laws on voting rights during that period. But at least on this one question, should we be making voting easier or should we be making it harder? We had relative consensus on that question. And then before the 2012 election, that consensus completely broke down. And the trajectory in terms of voting access in this country, for the first time in decades, started to turn the other way. Now, why? Why did that happen, right, in the run-up to the 2012 presidential election? Well, if I'm trying to understand what happened in one presidential election, I look back at the previous presidential election, right? So 2008. Young people turned out at a higher rate than they had since 1992. Voters of color were a quarter of the eligible electorate in a presidential election for the first time in our nation's history, right? And obviously, we elected our first black president, right? It's only when that happens that suddenly you start hearing not just a few whispers, but a chorus of people saying, voting's too easy. We have to make voting harder. Voting is not clean in this country, that there's corruption and cheating, and we need stricter rules to prevent those things from happening. It's as if people looked at an electorate that looked like the electorate that we had in 2008, and a president who was elected in that election who looked like the president that we had elected, right? And decided that in the absence of any evidence of fraud or cheating in any substantial amount, that election just can't be legitimate, right? There's something inherently illegitimate about an electorate that looks like that, and we got to start cutting back. And if you look at the laws that were passed, right, they didn't just make voting harder generally for everybody, but they were almost in every instance surgically targeted at exactly those demographics that were emerging in 2008. And I want to give you just 3 examples of laws that civil rights organizations like the ACLU and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where I used to work, and I understand that Natasha Merle came and talked to you guys yesterday, challenged in the 2012 election cycle. So if you think about the voting process, 3 critical points, right, at least in terms of the laws surrounding voting, right? The registration process, the voting before Election Day period, right? So early in-person voting and absentee voting, and then voting on Election Day itself. And every one of those points saw new restrictions before the 2012 election. So I'll just give you an example of one of each of those. The registration process. So Florida passed a law in 2011 that created new restrictions on voter registration drives. Now, what did that mean? It meant that if you wanted to touch a voter registration form, just touch a voter registration form filled out by anyone other than a member of your immediate family, you had to register with the state before you did that. You had to file monthly reports about the number of voter registration forms that you handed out and the number that you collected. And you had to turn those forms in within 48 hours. If you did not, you were subject possibly to fines of $50 per form per day late. Right? So the League of Women Voters in Florida immediately canceled all voter registration activities because they couldn't expose their members to that kind of risk. The NAACP of Florida, which I represented in litigation over this issue in 2012, told me that they could muster only about half as many volunteers to do voter registration drives before the 2012 election as they could in the 2008 election because people were just too scared, right? Just to take one example of how serious the state was about this, in Okaloosa County in Florida, the Okaloosa NAACP branch got in trouble for turning in 2 forms 2 days late. They had collected them on a Saturday. They turned them in on a Tuesday. They didn't turn them in on Monday because Monday that week was Martin Luther King Day, and the office was closed. But they still got a threatening letter from the Secretary of State telling them that they were going to be subject to fines if they did it again. Yeah. Now, who uses voter registration drives? Right? Well, if you look at census data in the state of Florida, it's about 6% of white voters, right? But it's about 18% of Latinos and African Americans who are registered to vote in the state, right? And I have to tell you, that's not a secret, right? It's not like they passed a new restriction on these voter registration drives, and then, you know, a few months later, someone said, hey, by the way, do you know who uses voter registration drives, right? No, politicians' jobs depend upon knowing who's in the electorate and what methods of participation those people use, because that's how they get reelected, right? So it's not a surprise to these folks. They knew exactly what it was that they were doing based on publicly available information about how people register, and this is what they decided to do, despite there not being any evidence that these voter registration drives in Florida were causing any kinds of problems. Second example from the 2012 cycle, early voting. And I'll stay in Florida. So after 2000 and the debacle in Florida in 2000, Florida adopted an early in-person voting period so that if you couldn't make it to the polls on election day, you could vote up to 14 days in person before the election. Has lots of benefits, obviously has benefits to the voters who maybe have trouble getting to the polls on election day. It's better for elections administrators because if you're processing voters before election day, that means fewer lines on election day itself, fewer problems. If someone has a problem trying to vote during the early voting period, maybe you can work that out before election day and make sure that that person, that their ballot gets counted. So before the 2012 election, Florida said, you know what, we're going to get rid of the first 5 days of the early voting period, and we're going to get rid of the last day of the early voting period. Anyone know what the last day of the early voting period in Florida was?
Sunday.
Sunday. Now, can anyone guess why Sunday might be an important early voting day? Souls to the polls, right? So churches, right? So if you look at the demographics of who uses early voting in Florida, right? African Americans are about 20% of registered voters in the state. They were about a third of people voting on Sundays, right? Again, not a mystery, right? It's all there. It's all publicly available information. What's really interesting, though, is the timing of all of this. Because historically, early in-person voting has, before recently, so before the last decade, was more frequently used by white voters, more frequently used by older voters, more frequently used by higher income, higher education voters. And if you think about it, you know, why might that be the case? There are a lot of reasons why, you know, people speculate that that might be the case. You know, it might have something to do with where information is distributed, how easily accessible it is, right? Everyone knows, or not everyone knows, but a lot of people know when election day is, right? But to drill down and figure out what other options are that are out there, typically you need to have more information at your disposal, right? So 2004, 2006, early voters in Florida were disproportionately white. 2008, flip the script. For the first time in Florida's history, early voters were disproportionately African American. About 25% of white voters cast their votes early in the 2008 presidential election in Florida, but more than half of black voters did. And it's only when that happens, right, that suddenly the Florida legislature says, you know what, we got too much early voting. We got to cut some of that back, right? Third example, voting on election day. So a number of states before the 2012 election passed strict identification requirements for voting at the polls on election day. What does that mean? I'm sure you've heard a lot about this, and I know Natasha was here yesterday talking about some of the litigation that LDF has on these issues. It means that you need one of a limited set of forms of government-issued photo ID in order to cast a ballot. And when I talk about this issue, even with progressives, people who are sympathetic, people who are in favor of voting rights, a lot of times I get pushback. I get, well, what's so hard about that, right? Most people have ID. And you know what? They're right. Most people do have ID. But not everyone has one of these limited forms of government-issued photo ID. In state after state where we've looked, about 10% of registered voters don't appear in their state's driver's license or ID database. So you know there's a chunk of people out there who don't have these IDs, and it's not easy for everyone to get them. Usually to get an ID, even if the ID card itself is offered for free, you need an underlying document like a birth certificate to get the ID, and that's not free. It can cost $20 or more. And remember, I mentioned earlier in 1966, the Supreme Court struck down poll taxes. Does anyone know how much the poll tax was in 1966 that the Supreme Court struck down? Anyone? $1.50, right? Unconstitutional. Now, most people could probably pay $1.50, but we've decided as a society that a person's right to vote shouldn't cost a thing, right? And it shouldn't be conditioned on a person's ability to make even that relatively modest payment. And if it's unconstitutional to require someone to spend $1.50 to exercise their right to vote, then I think it should be unconstitutional to require someone to pay $20 or more for a piece of paper so that they can cast a ballot. But leave all that aside and let's just think about how these laws actually work in practice, right? So let's say even, there isn't that outlay of money or something like that. So I think Natasha talked about the Texas voter ID law, right? So in Texas, right, if you want an ID, you have to go to the Department of Public Safety, right? And a third of counties in Texas do not have a Department of Public Safety. So you got to drive somewhere, right? And remember, if you need an ID, it means it's because you don't have a driver's license, right? So you got to get over to the next county. And you may have heard this expression, everything's bigger in Texas, right? So in some rural counties in West Texas that don't have a Department of Public Safety, it's a round trip of over 200 miles to get to the nearest office, right? Now, if you look at the data, it suggests that African Americans and Latinos in Texas are less likely to have a driver's license or a state-issued ID than white voters, are more likely to live in a household where no vehicle is owned, right? So you can imagine what the burden of making that trip might be for someone of lesser means, and how that burden falls disproportionately on voters of color, right? Now, the devil's also in the details in terms of the kinds of ID that are accepted. And you might know this one too, right? In Texas, driver's license, that's okay. Passport, that's okay. Military ID card, that's okay. Concealed weapons permit, that's okay too, right? University of Texas student ID card issued by the government of Texas, not accepted for voting purposes. Right? And now, if you think about the rationale behind this law, it's this notion that the government needs to know you are who you say you are before you vote to make sure that you're not cheating, right? And if that's the rationale, the fact that the government won't accept an ID card that the government itself issues I think tells you something about how real that rationale is. If instead you think about this law as something that's trying to, in subtle ways, shape the electorate, then it starts to make a whole lot more sense. Now, we challenged all of these laws in the run-up to the 2012 election. And the three that I mentioned, we were able to get blocked for the presidential election, thanks to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and a particular provision of that act that made states that had the worst histories of discrimination, places like Texas and Florida, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, made those kinds of states get approval from the federal government before making changes to their voting laws. So the hard work and the sacrifices of the civil rights generation, right, which gave us so many things, right, but among them gave us strong legal protections for our rights, right, were alive and well and working in 2012 to help safeguard our rights, right. A year later, or not even a year later, right, by June of 2013, the Supreme Court blew a big hole in that. In a case called Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court invalidated that particular part of the Voting Rights Act. They said not only that it was no longer necessary, but that it was so intrusive on the states that it was unconstitutional. Right? So the Supreme Court's not just saying, like, we don't think you need this anymore because racism, in our view, is a thing of the past. They're saying that even trying to fight it is something that you are not permitted to do as a Congress, right, to our federal government. This law, again, remember, that passed 98-0 in the Senate and that George W. Bush signed into law, right? So it's not, you know, some crazy reach that progressives are pushing, you know, for some long-term goal. We're just talking about preserving the hard-fought wins of the 1960s, which the Supreme Court stole from us, right? And after that happened, a number of the laws that had been blocked came back online. Texas voter ID, right? The day that the Supreme Court announces the decision in Shelby County versus Holder, the then Attorney General of Texas, Greg Abbott, who's now the governor of Texas, tweets it out, right? I guess he's, you know, ahead of his time in terms of like how we're going to learn our political news and about laws, right, in 2013. Tweets out, Texas voter ID is back, right? Mississippi implements its voter ID law. Alabama does. Virginia does, right? And a whole nother wave of laws comes online that previously we were trying or had successfully blocked for one presidential election. So as litigators, we've had to reinvent the wheel, figure out new ways to try to challenge these laws. And since that time, I'll say that some of the strategies that we've tried have worked. Some of them have been less successful, right? It's a mixed bag since 2012 in terms of what we've been able to stop and what unfortunately has ended up passing anyway. Let me give you just one example of a law that so I'll give you some good news, right? I don't want to be all gloom and doom, but let me give you an example of one law that we were able to stop earlier this year. And it comes out of the state of Kansas. Kansas passed a law in 2011. It went into effect in 2013 that requires people, new registrants. So if you registered to vote, you don't have to worry about, before 2013, you didn't have to worry about that. But if you were turning 18 in 2013 and you were a new registrant, you had to do something that people previously didn't have to do, which was you had to submit a document showing that you were a United States citizen along with your voter registration form, something like a birth certificate or a passport. Just a quick show of hands, how many of you brought your birth certificate or passport with you to the summit? All right, got a few. So, you know, we got a whopping maybe 6% of the room or so, maybe 10% of the room have their birth certificates or passports in their personal possession, right? Now, let me just see that show of hands again. Oh, who has them? Now, how many of you, if you were walking around, keep your hands up, I just want to see this. How many of you were walking around would give a copy of that document to a stranger?
No.
Right. So the effect of this law is to make voter registration drives impossible, right? Because if you're trying to conduct a voter registration drive and you're trying to get people to new registrants to vote, right? Most of them, the vast majority of them, are not going to have these documents on them. And if they are, they're certainly not going to give you a copy of it, right? Right? I mean, just imagine trying to register people to vote and saying like, hey, give me a copy of your birth certificate, right? Don't worry. Like, I got you, right? You're not going to have to worry about what's going to happen to that, right? I mean, maybe your best friend will do it, right? But for the most part, it's going to be really, really hard. In Kansas, in the 3 years that this law was fully operational before we brought our lawsuit, over 35,000 voter registration applications were rejected because they were not accompanied by these documents. It was 1 out of 7 registration applications in the state. So it's as if 1 out of 7 people who showed up to register to vote, their application just boom, right in the trash, right? Now, almost half of them were under the age of 30, right? So think about that, right? Like, why might that be the case? Well, the law only applies to people who are newly registering to vote. And if you think about, you probably, I suspect, right, if you're no longer at home, if you're at college, right, you're probably in your 20s, you're moving a little more frequently than people in their 30s and 40s. Your documents might be with your parents. Our clients, the League of Women Voters of Kansas, told us that they could not conduct voter registration drives on college campuses anymore because students didn't have their documents. Students who lived on campus didn't have their documents with them. They had, they were with their parents, and it was too burdensome to get them in time for registration before Election Day. Anyone know who the Secretary of State of Kansas is? Kris Kobach, right? He's the chief election official of the state of Kansas. He was also the head of President Trump's Election Integrity Commission, right? He's made a name for himself writing laws around the country that make it harder for undocumented people to exist in this country, right? The whole phrase, the expression self-deportation, right? The idea that we're going to make it so hard on undocumented people's lives that they're going to be so miserable that they're going to have no choice but to pick up and leave, right? You have Kris Kobach to thank for coining that expression. Since in the 2000s, he worked on laws like that. He's set his sights broader from xenophobia to voter suppression, right? So he's a jack of many trades, right? And he was the author of this law in Kansas. And he justified it based on the notion that there are non-citizens who are registering and voting in Kansas, right, in huge amounts, and that needs to stop. As if like people are uprooting their lives and their families, traveling thousands of miles across international borders so that they can vote for Kansas Agricultural Commissioner or something like that, right? But he's saying that I need this law. Right? Yeah, it stopped 35,000 people from voting, but I need this law to keep our elections clean, right? So we sued, we challenged this law. We didn't have that provision of the Voting Rights Act that we used to have, so we focused on other kinds of legal theories. We challenged this law under the motor voter law. And in the case, which went to trial just last March, we challenged Kris Kobach, who represents himself. He's a lawyer. We challenged him. Show us your evidence that non-citizens are registering to vote in the state of Kansas. 38. A total of 38 non-citizens who had registered to vote in Kansas dating back to 1998, right? So fewer than 2 per year. And on that basis, he wanted to justify a law that had stopped 1 in 7 new voter registration applications, right? I mean, it's absolutely insane. Now, what's even worse, I'll just say this just for a second. I don't want to spend too much time on this, on just telling a war story of this trial. But when you're a lawyer in litigation, you get to see the other side's documents, right? So we wanted all the records of these registrations, right? And here's what we found, right? Some of these 38 people, when they registered to vote, in response to the question, are you a citizen, yes or no, checked no, right? So they're not people trying to defraud the system, right? They're people who went to the DMV, they got this piece of paper in front of them, they signed it, and they answered truthfully that they were not citizens, right? But they ended up on the rolls anyway because of an administrative error, right? We saw people who had filled out voter registration forms, and where they were supposed to write their social security number, they wrote their alien registration number. Right? People whose files said that they got a voter registration card in the mail and immediately called the county clerk's office and said, take me off the rolls, I'm not a US citizen and I can't vote. So of those 38, right, a large number of them weren't people trying to register to vote in the first place, right? They were people who just ended up on the rolls because of administrative errors. We got that law struck down, right? We got a ruling. We got a ruling about a month ago finding that not just that it violated the motor voter law, but that it was unconstitutional. And that ruling came from a federal judge in Kansas named Julie Robinson, who was appointed by George W. Bush, right? And what that tells me is that when we have a fair day in court, when we're not just sort of like arguing in a fact-free world on Twitter or on Fox News or something like that, right? And we can just actually present evidence that a fair fact finder will look at that evidence and see that we've made our case, that these laws are burdensome and unnecessary, right? Now, that's the good news about where we are, that we've managed to figure out some strategies for fighting back against some of these laws. The bad news that I have to tell you is that we're not always successful. Right? Wisconsin's voter ID law, which we challenged first in 2011, and that case is still ongoing. It's been 7 years, right? That law isn't still in effect, right? Cutbacks to the early voting period in Ohio. We were able to stop some, but not all of them. And just a few weeks ago, we learned from the Supreme Court that we lost a case, also in Ohio, challenging a voter purge practice, where Ohio would knock you off the rolls if you hadn't voted for a while, under the assumption that if you hadn't voted, oh, well, that means you must have moved and you're no longer there, which is kind of crazy because in midterm elections, more than half of people don't vote, right? But Ohio got away with this purge practice. We presented evidence that black voters in the Cincinnati area were about twice as likely to get knocked off the polls as people living in predominantly white suburban areas. Didn't matter. Supreme Court said 5-4 decision, that's okay. And as you know, this administration, which is, I think, an order of magnitude different from other Republican administrations when it comes to voting rights. And you don't have to look any further than the records of the two Bush presidents and Reagan on voting rights issues, which weren't stellar, right, but weren't like this. It's a tough road ahead of us. When I look at the litigation, I have a few lessons. The first is we're not going to win every case because we haven't won every case. We've never won every case. But the unfortunate thing is I'd expect us to win fewer cases in the future than we've won in the recent past, as Trump gets more judges on the federal judiciary, including the United States Supreme Court. That's the first lesson I draw. The second lesson that I draw is that even if we were more successful in terms of the litigation, it wouldn't be enough. Because I have to tell you, in my career as a civil rights lawyer, one of the lessons that I think I heard in law school, but I didn't really learn until I experienced it, is that law is, and by law I mean litigation, lawsuits, going to court. Different from making laws in legislatures or at the ballot through referendums and initiatives. Lawsuits, at least in this era, and at best, are defensive, right? Are protective. Someone's trying to do something bad, we sue, we try to stop it. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we fail, and the bad thing still happens anyway. But what we can't do through lawsuits is create something better, right? I can maybe stop Kris Kobach from putting new voter registration requirements on people, but what I can't do is create a new voter registration system through a lawsuit that really is accessible to everyone, right? Inclusive and fair. If you look at our voter registration, systems, they were built decades ago, right? For a very different time, for very different forms of technology. Are all of our voting systems actually, right? If you look at things like the Electoral College, right? And they're not probably the best fit for our era, right? And the way we get there is not by suing, right? The way we get there is by building a broader culture around what it means to have a fair, just, and inclusive democracy, right? And then changing those laws through our elected representatives and through ourselves, right, by direct action. And that's the message that I want to leave with you all, that being a civil rights lawyer, being a litigator like me, I'm not going to say it's not important. Obviously, I think that it's important. I wouldn't have devoted my career to it if I didn't think so. But it's only one piece of the puzzle, right? The work that you're all doing right now and that you will do after you leave here, right? That's another hugely important piece of the puzzle. Because we can sue and stop all these new restrictions, right? But truly creating an energized electorate that really reflects the demographic diversity. I'm talking about all kinds of diversity, age, ethnicity, race, right? I can't sue to make that happen, right? It's up to folks like you all to help bring about that kind of inclusive democracy that I think we all want. So that's my spiel about where we are on voting rights, but I'm happy to just have a conversation if folks have questions and want to get started. Thanks.